The evening sun slanted low over the desert, painting the dry earth in shades of gold and rust. Heat waves shimmered above the sand like restless spirits, and the wind carried the faint scent of mesquite and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a lone hawk circled, crying out as if it, too, sensed the unease hanging in the air. A wagon stood still on the old trail, its wheels half sunk in the soft dirt, its horses restless and weary from the long day. Behind the reins sat a woman, her face pale under the shadow of her bonnet, one hand clutching her belly, as if to remind herself that life still grew inside her. Even here, where death had made its home, her eyes were wide, torn between two terrible sights ahead. Two wooden crosses stood not far apart, their shapes stark and lonely against the dying light. On each hung a man Apaches, stripped and bound, their chests rising weakly with the last breaths they could find. Blood had dried along their ribs, dark against their bronze skin. Yet their eyes burned with something fierce, something unbroken. The soldiers who'd brought her here stood back now, silent but waiting. They wanted her to speak the words that would decide who lived and who would die, and the silence between her heartbeat and the creak of the wagon boards felt like a noose tightening. The air was heavy with tension, with the smell of sweat, leather, and iron. The pregnant woman's hands trembled as she tried to find her voice. But her throat felt dry as the land around her. One of the soldiers, an older man with a scar over his cheek and a rifle slung across his shoulder, stepped closer. His boots ground into the dirt. He said she'd seen what these men had done, that justice needed to be served. But his tone carried no mercy. He told her she was the one they would listen to. She had been there when it happened. When her husband's ranch burned, when the night filled with shouting, gunfire, and smoke. Now she was the witness. And that made her the judge. Her breath hitched as she looked again at the men on the crosses. She had seen them before, she was sure of it. One of them had carried her out of the flames that night when her house was burning. She'd been too dazed to speak, too shocked to remember his face clearly. But she remembered his touch, rough but gentle, as he lifted her and led her to safety. The other one, she had heard his voice shouting in anger, fighting someone in the dark. Were they enemies that night, or had they been fighting to save her? The memory tangled in her mind, refusing to give her peace. The soldiers were growing impatient. They were men who had seen too much blood, men who did not care for doubts. They only wanted a name, a gesture, a sign from her that would let them finish what they started. The officer gave her a hard look, his eyes the color of cold steel. "You were there," he said, his tone low and steady. "You tell us which one led the raid. Point him out, and we'll end it quick." Her heart pounded. She could feel the baby inside her move, as if it sensed the fear that had wrapped around her chest. The wind picked up, carrying with it the creak of the crosses. One of the Apaches opened his eyes and looked at her. It wasn't anger she saw that, it was something deeper, something almost sorrowful. His lips moved faintly, too dry to form sound, but she thought she could read the words he tried to say, "Please. Remember." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to ask who he was, to ask what really happened that night, but the soldiers were watching her too closely. Her hands shook as she clutched her shawl tighter. Behind her, the officer took a slow drag of his cigarette, his gaze never leaving her. He wanted an answer before nightfall. The sun was slipping fast, and the desert did not forgive those who lingered too long in its open heart. She looked down at the dust beneath her boots. It was stained dark, where blood had fallen, where men had been made into warnings. These lands had known too many wars between settlers and tribes, between greed and survival. Each story left behind its ghosts. She'd thought she'd come west for a new beginning with her husband, to raise their child in peace. But peace had never been meant for these lands. Her voice finally broke the silence, hoarse and trembling. "You're asking me to choose?" she said. "But I don't even know the truth." The officer's jaw tightened. "You were there?" he repeated. "You saw them. One of them murdered your husband. The other helped him. We just need to know which is which." She turned her gaze toward the man on the left. His head hung low, hair matted with sweat and blood. The other's eyes still met hers, steady and unflinching. Something about him drew her, something familiar, like a memory half buried beneath fear. Her mind raced, searching for pieces of that night. She remembered the smell of smoke, the baby's cradle, her husband shouting her name, and then the sound of a rifle. Someone had dragged her outside, whispering words she didn't understand. Then the world had gone dark. When she woke the next morning, the house was ashes, and her husband's body was gone. The soldiers had found her days later wandering near the riverbank. They said it was the Apaches who did it. She had no reason not to believe them. Until now, the man on the cross met her eyes again, and she saw no hate in them. No guilt either, just quiet strength, the weight of something she could not name. Her hands gripped the wooden rail of the wagon as she whispered, "What if I'm wrong?" The officer spat into the dirt. "Then you'll carry that burden, same as the rest of us. But one of them is guilty. That's enough." She looked at him, then back at the two figures framed against the burning sky. The wind blew harder now, whipping strands of hair across her face. Her dress clung to her as if the desert itself didn't want to let her go. Somewhere in the distance, thunder grumbled rare for these parts, but it was coming. She felt it deep inside her, a slow, rolling unease that mirrored the storm building in her chest. Her child kicked again, strong and restless. She pressed her palm to her belly. "What kind of world am I bringing you into?" she whispered under her breath. The soldiers didn't hear her. They were too busy watching the light fade from the horizon, readying themselves to finish their work. The officer stepped closer again, the leather of his coat creaking. "It's time, ma'am. Choose." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The two men hung before her, silent and waiting, like the desert itself had stopped breathing. She could still walk away. She could close her eyes, refuse to speak, and let fate decide. But if she did, one of them, maybe both, would die for something she might never understand. Her mind screamed for mercy, but her voice could not form the word. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the faint cry of the hawk again. The officer's shadow loomed over her, long and dark in the evening light. And then, faintly, she heard one of the men whisper something. She couldn't tell which one it came from. The sound was weak, but full of desperate calm. "Don't let them break you." Her heart froze. The soldiers looked at her, waiting for her to raise her hand, to point. To decide, tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Please, don't make me choose." The officer said nothing. He only nodded once to the men beside him. One lifted his rifle. The woman gasped, stepping forward without thinking, shouting for them to stop. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if urging her to act. The wind tore her words away, scattering them into the dying light. The rifleman hesitated, glancing at the officer, and in that single breath before the trigger could fall, the pregnant woman's scream echoed through the desert, raw and pleading, caught between guilt, memory, and the mercy she no longer knew how to give. Then the sound of thunder rolled closer, dark clouds swallowing the last of the sun, leaving everything suspended between life and death. Justice and doubt waiting. For the next choice that would decide them all, the thunder rolled like a warning through the open desert, its sound blending with the uneasy stillness that followed the woman's scream. The soldiers froze for a moment, their rifles still raised. The smell of gunpowder thick in the air, though no shot had been fired yet. The officer's jaw flexed as he studied her. He wasn't used to hesitation. He wasn't used to anyone questioning orders. But there was something about this woman, something that made even him pause. She wasn't just another settler's wife. She was carrying new life in her belly, trembling in her torn shawl, and yet still standing firm against him. The wind picked up, scattering sand across their boots. The officer gestured for the men to lower their rifles, at least for now. He turned back to her, voice calm but cold. "You think standing there crying will change what's been done? This land doesn't forgive, ma'am. It never has." She looked up at him, eyes rimmed red from tears. "I don't even know what's been done," she said quietly. "I remember fire. I remember shouting. But I don't know who started it. You ask me to choose between two lives when I can't even trust my own memory." The officer's expression hardened. "You don't need memory. You need courage." One of them raided your home. One of them killed your husband. That's the truth." She shook her head. "That's what you think is the truth. But you weren't there." The officer didn't answer. He turned away, his boots crunching over the dirt as he walked toward the campfire nearby. The soldiers followed, muttering to one another in low voices. The woman stayed where she was, her breath shaky, her gaze still locked on the two figures hanging on the crosses. The sun had vanished completely now, and the desert was cloaked in a strange violet light. Shadows stretched long and thin, and the smell of rain drifted faintly through the air. She could hear the rasping breaths of the men on the crosses. One of them moaned softly, a sound that cut through the quiet like a knife. She wanted to look away, to hide her face. But something deep inside her wouldn't let her. She stepped closer, each movement heavy with dread. Her boots sank into the loose soil, and the wind carried whispers from the dry grass. The Apache on the left lifted his head weakly. His lips moved again, but this time she could hear the faintest trace of a voice. "You. Remember me?" Her heart skipped. She leaned forward, struggling to understand him. "Who are you?" she whispered, his eyelids fluttered. "River. Near the oak tree. You fell." The word struck her like a blow. A flash of memory burned through her mind at the riverbank, cool rush of water and a hand reaching down to pull her from the current. That night, when she had fled from the burning house, she'd stumbled into the river trying to escape. Someone had saved her, but she'd never known who. Now she wasn't sure if the man before her was that same person, or if her mind was playing cruel tricks. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Why were you there that night?" He struggled to speak, his voice barely more than breath. "Not raid, protect." Before she could ask more, the officer called from behind her. "Stay back from them. They're killers, not men." She turned sharply, anger flaring through her fear. "If they were killers, they'd have let me die. But one of them saved me." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Saved you? You think these savages saved you? You must be out of your mind." Her hands balled into fists. "You don't know what happened. You only know what you were told." Took a step closer, his voice low but edged. "What I know, ma'am, is that your husband's ranch is ash, his men dead, and every track out there leads back to the Apache camp. Don't talk to me about not knowing." The woman turned away, her throat tightening. The memory of her husband's laughter, of the way he used to sit by the fire, humming old songs, filled her chest with pain. He had been a good man, trying to make a living in a land that didn't want settlers. But she also remembered how quickly things had changed the night before the attack. When he'd argued with one of the soldiers over stolen cattle, when he'd said something about revenge and justice. The next day, everything was gone. The officer's words echoed in her head, but so did the faint, broken voice from the cross. "Protect." She wrapped her arms around herself as the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm was coming fast, lightning flashing over the distant hills. The soldiers cursed under their breath as they began to secure their camp, tying the horses, covering their rifles. The officer barked orders, but his eyes kept darting back toward the woman. Watching her every move, she stayed by the crosses. The rain was light at first, washing the dust from her face, then heavier, soaking through her clothes. The Apaches shivered, their breaths shallow and ragged. She knew they wouldn't survive the night if left like this. Her mind churned with questions. If one of them truly was guilty, why did the other one stay silent? Why hadn't either begged for mercy? Why did the one who spoke sound more worried for her than for himself? The officer came back, rain dripping from his hat brim. "We'll camp here tonight. Storm's too rough to move. Tomorrow morning we finish this." "Finish it how?" she asked. He gave her a cold look. "You've had your chance to choose. Since you couldn't, we'll hang them both. Easier that way." Her heart lurched. "You can't do that. You don't even know if they're guilty." He turned to her, his tone final. "This land doesn't care about guilt. It cares about order, and I'll have it one way or another." He walked away, leaving her standing in the rain. The storm grew stronger, the sky alive with flashes of white light. She sank to her knees in the mud. Staring at the two men she might soon see die, Her mind went back to the first time she and her husband arrived out here. The land had seemed endless and full of promise. He'd built their small cabin near a spring, proud and full of plans. She had been happy then, full of hope for the baby they would one day have. But hope was fragile in this place. Every sunset carried unease. Every stranger's shadow brought fear. The settlers and the tribes had lived on the edge of conflict for years. A treaty would be signed one season, broken the next. Men like her husband believed the land was meant to be tamed. Men like the officer believed peace could only be built through power. But the Apaches saw it differently. To them, the land wasn't something to own, it was something sacred. Somewhere in that divide, lives were lost, and truth got buried beneath revenge. The rain drummed harder. She looked at the crosses again. The one who had spoken River, if that was his name, was barely conscious now. She could see the rise and fall of his chest slowing. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't let both men die without knowing the truth. She rose to her feet and looked toward the soldiers. Most had retreated to the shelter of the wagons. The officer was sitting near the fire, smoking his pipe, eyes fixed on the flame. She took a deep breath, grabbed a water canteen, and stepped toward the crosses again. The mud sucked at her boots as she walked. She lifted the canteen and held it to River's lips. He coughed weakly but drank what he could. When he spoke again, his words were faint but clear. Your husband. Not by us. Soldier man. Wanted gold. Blame tribe. Her eyes widened. What gold? He looked toward the officer's campfire, then back at her. Under cabin. No. He'd take it. Her thoughts spun. She remembered the officer arriving right after the fire, saying her husband had been buried and his things taken for evidence. She hadn't questioned it then. She'd been too broken, too lost. But now, something inside her stirred a spark of suspicion that cut through her grief. She looked toward the officer again. He sat there, calm and steady, pipe glowing in the dark. She suddenly wondered if his calm came from knowing no one would ever question him. The rain eased, leaving behind only the smell of wet earth. The wind had cooled. The camp was quiet now, except for the crackle of the fire, the faint groans of the wounded men. The woman stood between the two crosses, torn in ways she never thought possible. If River spoke the truth, then everything she believed about that night was a lie. But if he was lying, then she was letting her heart be fooled by a murderer. Lightning flashed once more across the sky, and for an instant she saw the officer watching her from the firelight, his eyes sharp and knowing. His hand resting casually on his revolver, she froze. He had seen her talking to the prisoners. He stood slowly, brushing the rain from his coat, and began walking toward her. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She didn't move. The officer stopped just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. Long night, isn't it? He said quietly. Best get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be hard on everyone. She tried to hide the fear in her voice. You don't have to kill them. He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, Sometimes mercy is just another kind of weakness. And as he turned away, his shadow stretched over the crosses, dark and heavy. Like a promise she couldn't escape, the woman stood there long after he left, rainwater running down her face. Heart torn between truth and survival, between what she feared and what she was finally beginning to see. The night around her seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm that was yet to come. The fire burned low through the night, its orange glow flickering across the soaked ground. The woman sat near her wagon, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, though the cold wasn't what kept her trembling. Her eyes stayed fixed on the officer's campfire, where he sat talking in hushed tones with one of his men. Every few moments, their voices carried over the rain-soaked silence, sharp and quick, but never clear enough for her to understand. The crosses stood in the darkness beyond, barely visible now, except for their shadows moving when the lightning flared. She could hear the faint sound of one of the Apaches breathing, uneven but alive. That was something. She tried to tell herself that meant there was still time, but her heart didn't believe it. She couldn't stop thinking about what River had said. Gold buried under the cabin. A soldier stealing it, then burning everything to hide what he'd done. Her husband had never spoken of gold, but he'd often mentioned rumors of an old Spanish vein hidden somewhere near the riverbed. She remembered laughing about it, calling it a ghost's tale. But what if he'd found something, and that discovery had brought death to their door? Her thoughts were broken by footsteps. She stiffened as the officer approached. His face was half-shadowed, rain still dripping from his hat. "You're awake," he said, his tone unreadable. "I couldn't sleep," she answered, her voice thin. He crouched beside the fire, feeding it another stick of wood. "You shouldn't think too much about what's coming. It only makes things harder." Her eyes flicked toward the crosses. "You mean what you're going to do at sunrise?" He didn't look up. "It's justice. Might not look clean, but nothing out here ever is." She hesitated before asking, "Were you there that night? At my ranch?" He paused, his hand hovering over the flames. "I arrived after. You were barely alive when we found you. Found me or made sure I couldn't talk?" He turned slowly, his eyes cold and sharp. "Careful, ma'am. You're walking close to insult." She didn't back down. "River said someone wanted gold. That my husband didn't die by their hands." A muscle in his jaw twitched, but he didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. "You believe a dying Apache over your own people? They're known for lying. They twist truth into pity. Don't let them poison your thoughts." She wanted to argue, to demand answers, but his stare silenced her. He stood again, brushing the mud from his coat. "Get some rest," he said. "We move out after dawn. Then this is finished." She watched him walk away until his figure blended into the dark. The rain had stopped, but the storm clouds still pressed low and heavy. Holding back the stars, the baby shifted inside her, a small flutter that reminded her she wasn't alone. She pressed a hand to her belly, whispering softly, "I'll keep you safe." But even as she said it, her voice wavered. A voice came from behind her, weak and hoarse. "You shouldn't trust him." She turned sharply. The other Apache, the one who hadn't spoken before, was awake now. His voice was raspy from thirst, but his eyes were alert, watchful even in pain. She rose and went closer, careful to stay quiet. "You can talk." He gave a faint nod. "He doesn't know you heard the truth yet. Don't let him see it." She glanced back toward the camp. The soldiers were half asleep, the officer's pipe glowing faintly in the dark. She whispered, "Who are you to him?" The Apache's breath came unevenly. "He killed my brother last spring. Took the land near the canyon, said it was for the army. We fought back, not for war, for home. He burned our camp. Then he blamed us for your fire too." Her chest tightened. "So you're saying he used me? Used my husband's death to cover his own crimes?" The Apache's gaze was steady. "He's done worse for less." The woman stood silent for a long moment, trying to hold on to reason while everything around her began to tilt. She wanted proof, not whispers. But proof was buried in ash. The only people left who could tell her the truth were dying before her eyes. She knelt beside him, lowering her voice even more. "If you tell me everything you know, maybe I can stop this before morning." The Apache's breathing grew slower. "He'll never let us live. You either." He can't risk the truth walking away. Fear prickled down her spine. She looked again toward the campfire. The officer's eyes were open, staring straight into the night. For a fleeting second, she thought he was looking right at her. She stepped back quickly into the shadows, pulling her shawl tighter. The rest of the night crawled by. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her husband's face in the firelight, his hand reaching out, his mouth trying to speak, but the memory always blurred before he could say anything. When dawn finally came, the sky was pale and heavy with leftover rain. The ground steamed in places where the sun began to warm it. The officer woke the men early, barking commands, his mood sharp and focused. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd already decided how the day would end. The woman didn't speak as they prepared. Her face was calm, but inside her thoughts ran wild. She had no weapon, no proof, and no one to trust. But she did have fear, and fear could be turned into courage if it had to be. As the soldiers readied the horses, one of the younger men, barely more than a boy, came up to her. He looked uneasy, eyes darting toward the officer before whispering, "You shouldn't be here when he does it. Ain't right making you watch." She looked at him closely. "You've seen what he does before, haven't you?" The boy swallowed hard. "I've seen him hang men who didn't deserve it, if that's what you mean. But saying it don't change a thing? He's got friends high up. Nobody questions him." She touched his arm gently. "Then you know what I say is true." He blinked, uncertain. "What do you mean?" "Those men didn't burn my ranch," she whispered. "He did. Or someone working for him. There was gold involved. My husband died because of it." The boy's eyes widened. He looked back at the officer, then at her. "You can't say that out loud. He'd shoot you before you finished the sentence." "Then help me," she said quietly. "Help me prove it." Before he could answer, the officer called his name sharply, and the boy stepped back, fear etched on his face. He gave her one small, helpless look before walking away. She stood there, her heart pounding as the soldiers moved toward the crosses. The officer gestured for them to cut the ropes holding the men's arms. They fell to the ground, too weak to stand. The officer looked at her. "Last chance. Say who's guilty, and we'll end this clean." She looked between the two Apaches. Both were beaten, bloodied, but alive. River's eyes met hers again, calm and steady, even through the pain. The other man, the one who'd spoken during the night, gave her a faint nod, urging her not to speak. The officer's patience was gone. "Fine," he said flatly. "Then they die together." She took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Wait, you said this was about justice? Then prove they're guilty. Show me something, anything that says they did this." He turned to her slowly, his expression cold. "You think I need to prove myself to a widow? You forget your place, ma'am. You're lucky we even took you in." Her anger broke through her fear. "You didn't take me in? You used me." A murmur went through the soldiers. The officer's eyes flashed. "Careful," he warned. "You killed my husband," she said, her voice stronger now. "You killed him for gold and burned everything to cover it." He stepped closer, his hand resting on his gun. "You don't know what you're saying?" "I know you lied," she said. "I know one of those men saved my life, not took it." The air went still. Even the horses shifted uneasily. The officer's eyes darkened. "You shouldn't have remembered." The young soldier she'd spoken to moved slightly, uncertain. "Sir," he began, "maybe we should wait. Check the cabin ruins again?" "Quiet." The officer snapped, his gun now fully drawn. The woman didn't flinch. "If you shoot me, they'll know. All of them will know." His lips twisted into a cold smile. "They'll know you went mad. Grief does that. You'll be buried by noon, and no one will ask another question." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The desert was silent except for the buzz of flies and the low moan of the wind. Then, without warning, thunder cracked again, not from the sky this time, but from a rifle. The woman gasped as the officer's hat flew off his head, spinning into the dirt. The young soldier stood behind him, hands shaking, the barrel of his rifle still smoking. "Don't move," the boy said, his voice trembling but clear. "I've seen enough killing." The officer turned slowly, rage and disbelief etched on his face. The boy's hand shook harder. "You're done, sir? You're not hanging anyone today." The officer took one step toward him. Eyes blazing, the woman stood frozen, torn between terror and estranged. Rising hope, the wind carried the smell of gunpowder and rain again, and as the sun climbed higher over the desert, no one dared to breathe, the standoff stretching like the endless horizon. Waiting for a single decision to break the silence, the desert morning stood still, caught between fire and silence. Dust hung in the air, drifting through the thin light of dawn. The officer's hat lay in the dirt, a small black shape beside his boots. He stared at the young soldier who had dared raise a weapon against him. The boy's hands trembled, his face pale beneath the brim of his cap, but he didn't lower his rifle. The woman stood frozen near the crosses, one hand clutching her belly. Her heart pounding loud enough she thought the men could hear it. The officer's voice broke the silence, low and measured. "You're making a mistake, son." The young soldier swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the officer and the woman. "Maybe," he said, "but I'm not letting you hang them. Not after what I heard last night." A muscle twitched in the officer's jaw. "You don't know what you heard. She's lying. That's what grief does. It poisons the mind." The boy's grip tightened. "She's not lying. I saw how you looked when she said your name. You knew she was right." For a moment, no one breathed. Then the officer took a slow step forward, his tone calm but deadly. "Lower your gun." "That's an order." The boy shook his head. "Orders don't mean much when they come from a killer." The officer moved faster than anyone expected. His hand shot to his belt, drawing his revolver in one swift motion. The woman screamed as the two guns fired almost together. Dust kicked up. The echo rolled across the desert. Bouncing off the distant canyon walls, the boy stumbled backward, the rifle slipping from his hands. He hit the ground hard, clutching his shoulder where blood began to bloom through his uniform. His face twisted in pain, but he was alive. The officer's shot had only grazed him before he could fire again. The woman ran forward, grabbing the rifle from where it had fallen. Her hand shook as she pointed it at the officer. "Don't move," she said, her voice breaking. He turned slowly toward her, his expression unreadable. The barrel of her gun wavered, but she didn't lower it. "You won't shoot me," he said softly. "You're not built for it." Her throat tightened. "Try me." Behind them, the two Apaches stirred, struggling to rise despite their injuries. River's voice came out weak but firm. "He will kill you both if you don't end it." The officer laughed under his breath, taking a step closer. "Listen to them. Savages talking about mercy. You don't even know what they are." "I know they didn't burn my home," she said. He stopped. His smile faded. "You think that matters?" "The world believes they did. That's what history will say. You think anyone will care about the truth of a widow and a dying savage?" The woman's arms trembled, her finger hovering near the trigger. "You cared enough to bury the truth yourself." His voice sharpened. "I did what I had to do. Your husband found gold on Apache ground. I warned him to leave it. He wouldn't listen. He thought he could buy safety. Men like him always think that. So I took it from him before the tribes did." The words hit her like a slap. "You killed him for greed." He shook his head. "No, I killed him for order. He was a fool. If the others had found out about that gold, this whole land would have been fire and war again. I did what needed to be done." "Then you burned my home," she said, her voice rising. "You let me believe they were to blame?" He met her gaze, unflinching. "You needed someone to hate. Everyone does. I gave you a reason to survive. For a heartbeat, the desert was utterly still. Even the wind had died." The woman's vision blurred with tears, the rifle heavy in her hands. "You're wrong," she whispered. "You gave me something else. A reason to fight." The officer took one more step, slow and deliberate. Then pull the trigger. The standoff stretched until time itself seemed to hold its breath. The rifle trembled in her grip, her finger tightening, but she couldn't make herself fire. Not yet. The officer saw her hesitation and smiled faintly. "You don't have it in you. You're still that scared girl running through the fire, waiting for someone to save her. But no one's coming this time." Before he could move again, a voice cut through the air. "You're wrong about that." River had somehow managed to push himself to his knees. His body shook with pain, but his eyes burned with fierce resolve. The other Apache reached over, cutting through the last of his bindings with a jagged piece of wire. The officer swung his revolver toward them. The woman shouted, "Don't," and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, grazing the officer's arm. He turned back to her, fury in his eyes, and raised his gun. A blur of movement followed. River lunged forward, tackling the officer's legs with what little strength he had left. The revolver went flying. The two men hit the ground, struggling in the dirt, fighting for the weapon that had fallen between them. The soldiers who had been standing by the horses hesitated, unsure what to do. None wanted to turn against their commanding officer, but none wanted to shoot into the chaos either. The young soldier, bleeding but still conscious, crawled toward his rifle. The woman stood frozen, unable to move as the fight rolled closer to her feet. River managed to grab the officer's wrist, twisting hard until the gun spun free. The officer slammed his elbow into River's jaw. Knocking him back, he scrambled for the weapon again. Fingers brushing against the handle, then the young soldier's shot rang out. The bullet struck the dirt near the officer's hand, kicking up a spray of sand. It wasn't a killing shot, but it stopped him. "Stay down," the boy shouted, his voice raw. "It's over." The officer rose slowly to his knees, his face streaked with blood and dust. "You don't understand," he said, voice hoarse. "If I fall, everything we've built out here falls with me. You think the army will believe a wounded woman and 2 dying Apaches over me? They'll string you up right beside them." The woman shook her head. "Then we'll show them proof. You said the gold was under the cabin? We'll dig it out. We'll tell them everything." His laugh was bitter. "There's nothing left to dig. I moved it weeks ago. You'd think I'd be fool enough to leave it buried where anyone could find it." She felt her stomach twist, both from fear and the weight of the child inside her. The officer's words carried a truth she didn't want to face. He wasn't afraid of losing. He was afraid of being exposed. The wind returned, carrying the smell of rain again. Clouds gathered in the west, shadows crawling across the desert floor. The horses snorted, restless. River pulled himself upright, leaning on one of the crosses for balance. "The gold will curse you," he said, his voice low but steady. "It always curses men who take what isn't theirs." The officer turned toward him, fury and madness mixing in his eyes. "You think I'm cursed? I built law out of chaos. I gave this land order. I kept the settlers alive. Without me, it's nothing but dirt and blood." "It already is," River said. The officer lunged toward him, grabbing the fallen revolver. The woman screamed as he raised it again. The young soldier fired, but the shot missed. The officer spun, his rage blinding him, and fired back. The bullet hit the wagon behind the woman, splintering the wood. The horses reared, jerking against their reins, eyes wild with panic. One broke free, racing into the open plain. The chaos of movement, gunfire, and shouting filled the air. The storm overhead finally broke, rain falling in hard sheets. The officer moved through the downpour, his revolver aimed. His voice cut through the storm, raw and furious. "You'll die before they ever believe your lies." The woman stumbled backward, slipping in the mud. Her dress clung to her, heavy with rain. The rifle lay just out of reach. River pushed himself forward, each step dragging pain through his body. The second Apache, bleeding from the side, followed. Together, they stood between her and the officer. Unarmed, but unyielding, the officer stopped a few feet away, thunder cracking behind him. He raised the revolver once more, his hand steady, despite the rain. "You should have let me finish this when I had the chance," he said. Lightning flashed, bright and white, catching the gleam of the gun's barrel. The woman, kneeling in the mud, reached out blindly for the rifle. Her fingers brushed against it, slick and cold. The officer's finger tightened on the trigger. The young soldier, still bleeding, but standing now, lifted his rifle one last time. River looked back at the woman, his eyes full of something between sorrow and resolve. "Remember what you saw," he said. "Don't let them bury it." The storm roared around them, drowning out every other sound. Then came the next shot, louder, closer. Final, and the desert seemed to hold its breath as the echo rolled away into the hills. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The rain poured harder, washing the blood into the mud, erasing footprints as fast as they were made. The woman stayed on her knees, her body trembling, unable to look up and see who had fallen. All she knew was that everything, her grief, her fear, her hope, was about to break wide open. And as thunder rolled over the land again, the story that began with fire and loss neared its reckoning. The truth hanging in the air like smoke before a storm yet to end. The echo of that last gunshot rolled away across the soaked desert, swallowed by the thunder. For a moment, the world was still again, caught between the roar of the storm and the weight of what had just happened. The woman knelt in the mud, her breath uneven, her body trembling as rain ran down her face. The air smelled of gunpowder and wet earth. She dared not look up. Not yet. Her ears rang, and all she could hear was the heavy beating of her heart. When she finally lifted her eyes, the sight before her stole what little breath she had left. The officer lay motionless in the mud, his revolver still clutched in his hand. A thin trail of blood ran down his temple, mixing with the rain. Behind him, the young soldier stood frozen, his rifle lowered, eyes wide in shock at what he'd done. River knelt beside the fallen man, his hand pressed against his own wound. His expression calm but tired. "It's over," the woman whispered. Though the words sounded strange coming from her lips, the storm began to ease, as if even the sky had spent its anger. The thunder faded into the distance, and the rain softened to a steady drizzle. The young soldier slowly approached, lowering his rifle all the way. He stared down at the officer who had commanded him for years. The man he had once believed stood for law and order. "I didn't want to do it," he said quietly, but he wasn't going to stop. River looked up at him, his dark eyes steady. "Sometimes the world doesn't give us a choice. You did what was right." The woman pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the flutter of her heartbeat. Her child kicked gently, a faint reminder of life amid all the ruin. She looked at the crosses standing behind them, their shadows long and thin against the storm-gray light. 2 broken men had been tied to them, condemned by lies, and yet they still lived. That felt like a miracle. The young soldier turned to her. "What now? When the others ride back from the ridge, they'll ask what happened." She met his eyes, her voice steadier than before. "We tell them the truth." He hesitated. "You think they'll believe it?" "No," she said softly, "but they'll have to face it." They buried the officer before nightfall. The ground was soft from the rain, the mud clinging to their boots as they worked in silence. There was no prayer, no words of farewell. The desert had taken too much already, and it didn't care for speeches. When it was done, they stood over the simple mound, watching as the rain washed away the last traces of blood. River leaned on the wooden cross for balance. His breathing labored but even. "He will not rest easy," he said. "Men like him never do." The young soldier wiped his brow. "You should rest too. You've lost a lot of blood." River gave a faint smile. "Not yet. There's something I must finish." He walked slowly toward the wagon, where the woman sat wrapped in a blanket. The storm clouds had broken apart, and the first streaks of sunset bled across the sky, warm and gold against the cooling earth. The air felt cleaner, lighter somehow, as if the desert itself had drawn a long breath. "You are safe now," River said quietly. "But safety is a thin thing out here. It doesn't last unless you make it." She nodded, her eyes on the horizon. "I don't even know where to go. There's nothing left for me back there." "Then go forward," he said. "The land remembers those who walk it with truth." The young soldier joined them, glancing from her to River. "There's a post a few miles east. I can take you both there. After that, you'll be free to head north. Folks there don't ask many questions." The woman looked down at her hands, the dirt under her nails, the mud on her skirt. She felt empty and full all at once. The child moved again, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled faintly. "Free," she said under her breath. "That sounds strange." River's voice was soft. "Freedom always does, until you learn what to do with it." They stayed the night near the old wagon. The fire crackled low, throwing small, orange circles of light against the darkness. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the air was cold enough to sting. The young soldier kept watch, his rifle resting across his knees. The woman lay close to the flames, her head resting against a rolled blanket. Her mind wandering through memories she didn't want to keep but couldn't let go of either. She thought of her husband, of the day they'd first come west, chasing promise and land. She remembered his laughter, his stubbornness, his faith that good men could build something lasting out here. She thought of the fire that took it all, of the lies she'd believed, and of how easy it had been to lose sight of herself in the middle of so much hate in the quiet. She felt the baby stir again, and she whispered, "You'll never know that fire. I'll make sure of it." River sat across from her, his face lit by the glow of the flames. His wounds had been wrapped with strips of cloth torn from his shirt. He stared into the fire as though he could see something far beyond it. "You'll go back to your people?" she asked. He nodded slowly. If they will have me. I've been gone too long. They will, she said. You saved us, he smiled faintly. I did what the land asked of me. It doesn't matter who you are or what color your skin is. The desert doesn't care. It only gives to those who listen. Morning came soft and cool. The desert was washed clean, the ground glistening beneath a pale blue sky. The air smelled fresh, almost sweet. They hitched what was left of the wagon and began the slow journey east. The young soldier walked beside the horse, his arm still bandaged but healing. River rode in the back, too weak to walk long distances, though he insisted he'd be fine by the next day. The woman looked back once, toward the crosses, still standing in the distance. They seemed smaller now, almost like ghosts fading into the sunlight. She didn't know if anyone would ever find them again. Maybe that was better. Let the wind and sand take them. Let the past bury itself. By the second day, they reached the trading post the soldier had mentioned. It was a small cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by scrub and silence. A few settlers watched as they arrived, their faces curious but wary. The woman felt their eyes on her, saw the way they looked at the two wounded Apaches, and for a moment her chest tightened. The young soldier stepped forward, his voice firm. These folks are under my protection. Anyone with sense will leave it at that. No one argued. The settlers turned back to their work, pretending not to stare. The woman knew their silence wasn't kindness, but it was enough. She found a small room at the back of the post, a narrow bed and a cracked window that looked out toward the open plains. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. As she washed her hands in a tin basin, the water ran brown with dirt and blood. Watching it swirl away, she felt something inside her start to loosen. River came to the door, his steps slow but sure. This is where we part ways, he said. My path turns south from here. Her throat tightened. I don't know how to thank you. He shook his head. Don't. Just live true. Raise your child to know the land and respect it. That will be enough. She reached out and took his hand, pressing it gently. You've given me back more than I can say, River smiled. Then let that be the end of it. He turned and walked away, his figure growing smaller as he crossed into the horizon, his shadow stretching long in the morning light. The young soldier stayed behind a few days longer, helping her gather supplies and fix the wagon. When it was time to leave, he tipped his hat and said quietly, You'll do fine. You've got more strength than anyone I've ever met, she smiled, the first real smile in a long time. Maybe one day you'll find your own place too. Maybe, he said, looking toward the mountains. Or maybe this land will always keep me wandering. He rode off not long after, and the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the wind. The woman stood outside for a long while, watching the sunlight stretch over the desert. The sky was wide and endless, the same as the day she had lost everything, yet somehow it felt different now. The fear that had once bound her was gone. In its place was something quieter, steadier. She placed a hand on her belly and whispered, We're going home. Wherever that is, we'll find it. The wind carried her words away across the plains, soft and certain. The land before her waited, vast and untamed. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She climbed into the wagon, flicked the reins, and moved forward, leaving behind the graves, the crosses, and the lies that had nearly destroyed her. The sun rose higher, painting the sky in gold, and as the wagon rolled on, the desert stretched out like an open road, promising not peace, but possibility. And in that wide, quiet morning, where the earth met the sky and memory turned to dust, the story that began in fire ended in light.